What's up everyone, Darcblade here with another Hunter's Guide to Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak. In this video, we're going to be bringing you some full set budget builds, this time for the longsword. Now, a full set budget build is basically a basic build created from one armor set that is aimed to get you through the story of Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak and up to the point where you can start farming endgame and creating nick sets. Now, as always, if you find these builds helpful, please consider subscribing to the channel as well as leaving a like on the video, as it allows me to bring you more build videos for a variety of playstyles. So when it comes to the longsword, it's one of the weapons that has got a lot of controversy, but it's undeniably one of the most powerful weapons in the game. As well as being able to dish out a ton of damage quite quickly, it's also able to forego defensive skills thanks to the sheer number of counter mechanics that the weapon has. And this is reflected in the builds shown here. So the first build I'm going to be showing off is the general purpose budget build, but if you want a more colourful name, I'll call it the Goss Harag build. This is an all-round build that you can take against pretty much any monster you come across and perform quite effectively. So for this build you'll need the entire Goss Harag armor set, which includes the Goss Harag Helm X, the Mail X, Braces X, Coil X and Greaves X. For the Petalace, this is down to personal preference, but I recommend the Absolute Petalace for some extra health. And then for your talisman, not everyone will have the same talismans unfortunately, so try to get a talisman that allows you to get weakness exploit to level 3, whether that's through decoration slots or through the skill itself being on the talisman. As for the weapon, I'm using the Rosenhimmel, which is the Espinas longsword. As for the Rampage skill, this is down to personal preference depending on what dual socket you have available. I'm just going for a Spirit Bird double Rampage skill. So when it comes to the decorations, you've got a fair few to play around with, so I've gone for Grinder Jaws to max out Speed Sharpening, Wirebug Jaws to max out Wirebug Whisperer, Critical Jaws to max out Crit Boost, Venom Jaws to max out Poison Attack, and then a Tenderizer Jaw to max out Weakness Exploit. So if you've done what I've done here, you have a build with a raw attack of 340 with 32 poison rating, you have purple sharpness with 20% base affinity, which can easily be 70% when you take into account weakness exploit, and you'll have an OK defense of 691 that is strong against ice, water and dragon, but unfortunately weak to the other elements, especially fire. As for the switch skills, I always say these are down to personal preference. So when it comes to the skills, first of all you'll have Agitator at level 5. Agitator is a skill that kicks in whenever a monster becomes enraged. When this happens, you'll gain increased raw attack as well as base affinity. You'll then have Resentment at level 3, which is a byproduct of the armor we're wearing, but it's still useful. Whenever we have a portion of red health on our health bar, we'll gain increased raw attack. However, it is unlikely that you'll have a constant portion of red health on your health bar using this build. Next up, you have Critical Boost at level 3. Critical Boost is a skill that increases the damage of our critical hits, but only applies to the raw portion of an attack, not the elemental or ailment portion. You'll then have Weakness Exploit at level 3, increasing our affinity by potentially 50% whenever we're attacking monster weak points. You'll then have Poison Attack at level 3, increasing the poison rating and thus the build-up of the ailment on monsters. Poison Attack is definitely useful, as rarely is a monster completely immune to poison, and it allows for some damage over time against monsters even if you're not actively attacking them. You'll then have Critical Draw at level 3. This is a byproduct of the armor, but it is useful especially for the longsword and its special sheaths. Basically, this increases the affinity for a short time after performing a draw attack, but it doesn't apply to Silkbind attacks. Nonetheless, this is useful when it comes to the Sacred Sheath and the Special Sheath abilities for the longsword. You'll then have Punishing Draw at level 3, which allows our draw attacks to have increased attack power and allow them to have a stun effect, potentially allowing us to knock out monsters. This, combined with Critical Draw, work well in unison with one another. You'll then have Quick Sheath at level 3, allowing us to greatly increase the speed at which we sheath our weapon. This does apply to the longsword's sheathing abilities as well, not just the normal sheath. You'll then have Speed Sharpening at level 3, allowing us to quickly sharpen our weapon, getting back that purple sharpness. You'll then have Wirebug Whisperer at level 3, increasing the recovery rate of our wirebugs as well as how long we can hold additional wirebugs and more. This is useful when it comes to relying on the wirebug counters that are available for the longsword. You'll then have Ballistics at level 1, a byproduct of the armor, it's not needed on the longsword build whatsoever. You also have Slugger at level 1, again another byproduct, this time of the talisman, that makes it easier to stun monsters. And whilst this isn't the most useful for the longsword, it does work well in unison with Punish and Draw, but like I said, it's a byproduct. It's not going to be found on this build by default. So there you have it. As you can see, it's quite a strong build. All the skills work and synergize well with one another to make a potent all-round build. But every build out there has pros and cons. When it comes to the Goss Harag budget build, Its biggest pro is, again, its damage output. Most of these budget builds are able to dish out a large amount of damage to monsters, and whilst not the highest in the game, it's definitely strong enough to bring down monsters in a timely fashion. The next pro is that the skills on this build synergize well with one another. Critical draw, punishing draw, quick sheath, they all add to the quality of life for a longsword user. And then finally for the pros is that this build can be used against pretty much any monster out there, as it focuses more on raw attack than anything else, and the poison element is just a nice cherry on the top, as like I said, rarely is a monster completely immune to poison. But of course there are cons. One of the biggest cons for this build is, unfortunately, it lacks defensive skills. This is countered, however, by the sheer amount of counter attacks that the longsword has. But if you're not confident with the longsword's counter mechanics, then this could be a major con. And the final con is that sometimes you may run into sharpness issues. This is countered slightly thanks to speed sharpening, but it's still something to be aware of. All of this made this one of the most fun budget builds for the longsword. When I was first making up an early budget build, using Rarity 8 equipment, I was going to go with the Barioth set, but I found that the Goss Harag set suited my playstyle better. But of course there are more than just one full set budget build out there. Once you start getting through the game and start taking on the higher tier monsters, such as Elder Dragons, you may want to upgrade. And so for a Rarity 9 budget build, I recommend go with the full set Rathalos build. This again is a general purpose build, able to take on pretty much any monster out there. Focusing on raw attack more than anything else, it should see you through to the end of the game, and this build can even easily take on afflicted monsters via anomaly quests. So for this you'll need the entire Rathalos set, which includes the Rathalos Helm X, Mail X, Braces X, Coil X and Greaves X. Again, I'm using the Absolute Petalace for some extra health, and then when it comes to your talisman, again try to get a talisman that can have at least weakness exploit level 3 on it, whether through the skills or through the decoration slots. As for my weapon, there are a lot to choose from, to be honest. I would recommend going for something that has enough purple sharpness on it that you don't have to necessarily worry about sharpening all the time during the hunt. I've gone for the Fisher Force, which is the Malzeno longsword. Now remember, when it comes to the weapons on these budget builds, I've got through the game to the point where the weapons are maxed out. So your version of the weapon may be a lower level if you're going through the game for the first time. Nonetheless, they should still perform adequately well. And finally, for this weapon's rampage skill, I've gone for Spirit Bird Double again, as we only have a small tier 1 dual socket. So when it comes to the decorations, you've got a fair few to play around with again. So this time I've gone for a critical element jewel, as we are using an elemental weapon. This is pretty much purely optional in all honesty. You can drop this for something else if you so desire. I've then gone for a sheath jewel to max out quick sheath, critical jewels to max out crit boost, grinder jewels to max out speed sharpening, and a tenderizer jewel to max out weakness exploit. So if you've done what I've done here, you'll have a build with 392 attack with 30 dragon rating, you'll have a decent chunk of purple sharpness with 0% affinity, which can be 50% when you take into account weakness exploit, and you have a strong defense of 731 that is strong against fire, water and ice, but unfortunately weak to thunder and especially dragon. As for the switch skills, again, down to personal preference. So when it comes to the skills, first of all you'll have attack boost at level 7. This will increase the raw attack of a build, and at level 4 or above, it gives us a percentage bonus to our attack as well. You'll then have earplugs at level 5, allowing us to ignore all monster roars. This is a byproduct of the armor. Normally you wouldn't need this on the longsword, as you can simply counter monster roars. You'll then have critical boost at level 3, increasing the damage of our critical hits. You'll have weakness exploit at level 3, which allows our affinity to get to 50% whenever we're attacking monster weak points. You'll then have quick sheath at level 3, allowing us to sheath the weapon more quickly. You'll then have windproof at level 3, another byproduct of the armor, but is a useful quality of life skill that allows us to negate all wind effects. You'll then have Heartbreaker at level 3, allowing us to break monster body parts and sever monster tails more easily. You'll then have speed sharpening at level 3, allowing us to sharpen the weapon incredibly quickly. You'll then have critical element at level 2, which is a byproduct of the decorations I've been using. This increases the elemental damage when our hits crit a monster, and then you'll have slugger at level 1. Again, another byproduct, much like with the first build. So there you have it. That is the full set Rathalos build that I would recommend for a budget build. Like I said, there are some optional jewels here, like for example the critical element one you can drop if you are using a non-elemental weapon, for example, or if you prefer to use a different skill. The main reason this build has the Malzeno longsword is because the Rarity 9 version of the weapon still has very high raw attack despite being a dragon weapon, making it still useful to use, but you can switch it out if you so wish. Anyway, every build out there has pros and cons as always. When it comes to this build, its biggest pro is its damage output. It has massive raw attack, and even though dragon attack isn't great against every single monster out there, it's still strong enough to provide us some extra damage. Which in turn brings us to the second pro, which, despite being a dragon related weapon, this build can be technically used against any monster. The dragon rating is quite low and the raw attack so high that it shouldn't matter if you go up against a monster that is resistant to the dragon element. And the final pro is that this build has tons of quality of life skills, from quick sheath, windproof, part breaker, speed sharpening, earplugs, and more. They will all make a hunt feel easier than it is. But of course there are cons. As always, one of the biggest cons for this build is you may run into sharpness issues at time, but this is countered thanks to speed sharpening. And once again, if you are not confident when it comes to the longsword counter mechanics, then you may find that the lack of defensive skills on this build a little bit troublesome. But the longsword has access to so many counter attacks now, and with a bit of practice, you should be able to master them, allowing you to make use of one of the most deadly weapons in the game. That combined with these budget builds, and I will assure you, you will get through the story of Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak quite quickly in order to start farming mixed sets. So there we have it, that is the budget builds I would recommend for the longsword. What are your thoughts? Please leave a comment down below, and until next time, I've been Darcblade, bringing you another Hunter's Guide to Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak. Hope you enjoyed the video, thanks for watching, subscribe and like for more.